Monday night, the kids were already asleep in their rooms across the hall. Matt and Lynn sat side by side in bed, pillows propped behind them. He was reading a book about the Civil War, while she was engrossed in editing a marketing report. With a quiet sigh, Matt closed his book and rolled over onto his side, his eyes resting on his wife. He always found it endearing how the tip of her tongue peeked slightly from beneath her lips when she was deeply focused. Her pen hovered above the paper as she absently tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. "Linny?" She answered, without lifting her gaze. Matt waited for a moment, and then she finally turned to look at him. "Do you love him?" Lynn froze. Her complexion paled, and she stared at him silently. She couldn't bring herself to dodge the question or attempt to lie. Matt deserved better. "No," she said softly. "So it's just about sex, then?" "Matt, she began, trying to maintain eye contact but eventually dropping her gaze to the papers on her lap. "Yeah," she admitted quietly. "I think it's all about flirting, and sex." "I see," he replied. Silence hung in the air. "I think I'd prefer if you slept in the guest room," Matt said calmly, his voice even. She nodded, quietly slipping out of bed. Sliding her feet into her slippers, she reached for the robe draped over the chair. "Unless, of course, you brought him here, into this bed," Matt added, his tone still measured. "Because if you did, I'll never sleep in it again." "No," she replied quickly. "I didn't do that." She wanted to ask how he could even think such a thing, but given the circumstances, she knew the question would sound ridiculous. Without saying another word, Matt reached over to turn off the bedside lamp. He laid his head on the pillow and turned his back to her. Lynn stared at him for a moment, her face tight with pain, before leaving the room quietly and closing the door behind her. Friday night, when Matt arrived home, the house was filled with the aroma of something delicious cooking. He hung up his coat, and Lynn stepped out of the kitchen to greet him with a smile, though she made sure to keep her distance. She was wearing one of her elegant aprons, the kind she reserved for when guests came over. "Beth and Jason are having dinner at the Frankels, so I thought I'd make something special for just the two of us tonight," she said, her smile faltering slightly but still present. Matt glanced toward the dining room. The table had been set meticulously, covered with a crisp tablecloth, and adorned with their finest china and two of their best wine glasses. Cloth napkins were neatly placed in silver rings, with candles providing a soft glow. "It smells good," he said with a nod. "I'll go wash my hands and be down in a minute." When he returned, Lynn was in the process of bringing the food in from the kitchen. She carefully served each of them a portion of fried chicken accompanied by potatoes and string beans. A small salad with orange wedges sat prettily in a bowl to the side. As they sat down, Lynn smiled at Matt, her expression bright but tinged with visible tension. "This looks lovely," Matt remarked. Then, without warning, he stood up slowly. To Lynn's confusion, he climbed onto his chair, towering above the table. She watched in disbelief as he unbuttoned his pants, her confusion rapidly morphing into horror. Matt, with deliberate precision, urinated all over the table. He drenched the chicken, the garnishes, the salad bowl, and even the freshly filled wine glasses. His urine flooded the tablecloth and soaked the plates. "Matt! What are you doing?" Lynn exclaimed, her voice trembling with shock and disbelief. Buttoning up his pants and stepping down from the chair, Matt fixed his gaze on her. "I thought you might want to know what it feels like," he said, his tone steady and cold. "To have someone desecrate something you care about. Something you've put your love, time, and effort into. I figured it might give you some perspective." Lynn couldn't find the words to respond. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at him, utterly devastated. Matt walked to the closet, grabbed his coat, and left the house without another word. At 10:50, Matt stood up from his chair, walked over to the door, and closed it. He then took a dictionary from the bookshelf and placed it on the table. Flipping through the pages, he found the word he was searching for and read the definition aloud. A cuckold is a man with an unfaithful wife. He returned to his seat, repeating the word several times. I am a cuckold, he said, as though trying to grasp its meaning. I'm a cuckold. I've been horned. She gave me horns. For a while, he sat there silently, staring at nothing. Finally, with a sigh, he pushed the dictionary aside and resumed his work. Saturday afternoon. For heaven's sake, Lynn, what the hell did you expect? Arlene's voice carried a mix of frustration and incredulity. Lynn remained silent, unable to answer, while her friend Arlene continued. They were sitting in Arlene's kitchen, 2 cups of coffee steaming between them. You sneak around behind Matt's back with some other guy, Arlene said, noting Lynn's wince at the phrase, and now you're surprised he's angry and hurt? I'm not surprised, Arlene, Lynn replied softly. Does he even know how long it's been going on? Lynn shook her head. I have no idea. I don't even know how or when he found out. He doesn't want to talk about it, and we haven't discussed it at all. Do you think telling him it was only a few times would make any difference? Arlene pressed. Not to me, it wouldn't, Lynn said with a grimace. I mean, if the roles were reversed, if he had been with another woman, 5 times, 20 times, it wouldn't matter. I'd still be shattered. She sighed deeply, staring into her coffee. So no, I'm not surprised. Not one bit. I just don't know what to do. I can't get through to him, and I have no idea how to fix this. Arlene watched her friend stir her coffee absent-mindedly, her gaze sympathetic yet restrained. 3 weeks later, Wednesday afternoon. No, Matt said firmly, his voice resolute. No, I don't want her to tell me about this. The therapist, Isabel Harshman, frowned slightly. She had short, dark hair cut in a style reminiscent of the Beatles and wore a brown corduroy sweater. Don't you think that might help both of you? She asked gently. To understand why Lynn did what she did. Without so much as glancing at his wife sitting beside him, Matt replied, it might help Lynn to unburden herself, but I don't see how it helps me. To be honest, Dr. Harshman, I think I'm already suffering enough. Lynn hesitated before speaking. I thought if I told you about it, how it happened and why it happened, that maybe you'd understand I could never do anything like that again. Matt turned to look at her, his expression hard. Do you really believe that? Do you honestly think there's anything you can say to restore my trust in you? To make me feel like I don't have to worry about you for the rest of my life, wondering when you'll jump into bed with another man again? Lynn lowered her gaze to her lap. In a barely audible voice, she answered, no, Matt. I don't think there's anything I can say that would do that. 2 months later, Thursday evening. Oh, Matt, it's so beautiful here, Lynn said, her smile broad as she squeezed his hand across the table. They were seated on a veranda overlooking the Caribbean Sea. The air was warm, and the sky still glowed with the remnants of a fiery sunset. Between them sat a pitcher of sangria and a plate of fried shrimp. It really is beautiful, he replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. The tension on his face was subtle but unmistakable, especially around his eyes. He returned her hand squeeze for a moment before picking up his fork to spear another shrimp. Thank you so much for agreeing to come down south with me, she said warmly. Matt nodded, though his gaze seemed to dart away whenever their eyes met. An hour later, they were in their hotel room, making love. Afterward, they lay side by side, Matt on his back with his arms folded behind his head, while Lynn nestled against him with her head on his chest. That was wonderful, baby, she murmured, her voice low and content. Matt reached down to gently stroke her back. She seemed on the verge of sleep when she suddenly raised her head to look at him. Are you making me your mistress? She asked playfully. Matt's expression tightened, his brow furrowing slightly. He sighed. When we're in the missionary position. He trailed off, looking away. I can't stop seeing you with him. I imagine you looking up at him the same way." He left the sentence unfinished. The air between them grew heavy, and Lynn felt a sudden chill. Minutes later, Matt got out of bed, pulled on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, slipped on his sandals, and left the room without a word. 7 weeks later, Saturday night. They worked mostly in silence, sorting through their belongings in the living room. Lynn stood in front of the CD rack, sorting discs, while Matt was across the room, organizing books on the shelves. "Should I keep the Dickens novels?" Matt asked without looking up. "I've read them all." "Take them if you want," Lynn replied without much emotion. "I'm not going to read them." She pulled out another handful of CDs, setting the ones that belonged to Matt in a small stack beside her. Then, turning her head, she watched him for a moment. The muscles in his back moved under his tank top as he worked, each motion smooth and precise. The sight of it was painfully familiar, so much so that it brought tears to her eyes. In a quiet, trembling voice, she said, "You know this isn't what I want. I've never wanted this." Matt froze for a moment but didn't turn around. Instead, he remained silent, holding back the words they both already knew he would say. Then, without replying, he returned to his books. 5 weeks later, Sunday night. "Mommy. Mommy." Beth and Jason squealed as they jumped out of Matt's car and ran into the house, leaving their overnight bags forgotten on the ground. They raced toward Lynn, wrapping their arms around her in tight hugs, their voices overlapping as they excitedly shared their stories. They talked about the zoo, how the giraffes were their favorite animals because of their incredibly long necks, and how Daddy had bought them cotton candy. Then, they said, nearly out of breath, "We saw giant tortoises. They were amazing." Once their greetings were done, the children darted past Lynn into the living room, where they turned on the TV without hesitation. Matt followed behind, carrying the abandoned bags. He smiled as he approached Lynn. "They seemed to enjoy the zoo," he said. "Although I couldn't tell if they were thrilled or terrified by the giraffes. Those things towered over us at the wall, right above our heads." He paused, his smile softening. "They also loved the giant tortoises." It turned out to be a nice day. They chatted briefly before Lynn offered, "Would you like to come in for a cup of coffee? The coffee pot's on the stove." "No, no thanks," Matt said, his voice a little awkward. "I really should get going." Lynn tried to keep her smile steady. "Okay. Well, I'll see you Wednesday night." He nodded, turning back toward his car. She stood in the doorway, watching until the tourist disappeared at the end of the street, turning left out of sight. 4 months later, Monday evening. Beth sat at the kitchen table, coloring with a set of crayons, while Lynn cooked dinner. Nearby, Jason was on the floor, assembling his favorite wooden clown puzzle for what had to be the 500th time. The brightly painted clown had 17 pieces, and Jason always took pride in putting it together perfectly. "Mommy, are friends supposed to kiss?" Beth asked suddenly, looking up from her coloring. Lynn turned to face her, trying to gauge the question. "I don't know, dear." "What do you mean by that?" "Well," Beth said thoughtfully, "I never kiss Artie or Melissa or my school friends. I think it's gross to even think about kissing Artie. But we met one of Daddy's friends, and they kiss all the time." Jason chimed in without looking up from his puzzle. "Angela's nice," he said simply. Beth nodded in agreement. "Yeah, she's nice. She made us hot dogs and macaroni and cheese." Jason interrupted again, his voice animated. "And she said next time we could go out for ice cream." Beth leaned forward, her voice growing more serious. "But Mommy, she and Daddy kiss a lot. You know, like you and Daddy used to. Do friends always kiss?" For a moment, Lynn closed her eyes tightly, then opened them with a forced smile. "Well, honey, some friends kiss, and some don't. It all depends on the circumstances. But kids your age don't kiss their friends, so you don't have to worry about it, okay?" Beth nodded, satisfied, and returned to her coloring. She was drawing a duck, though to Lynn, it looked more like a stegosaurus. "Dinner's ready," Lynn called, and the kids rushed to wash their hands before sitting at the table. "At least 2 pieces of broccoli each," Lynn said as they sat down. "Otherwise, no dessert tonight." The children obediently put ketchup on their hamburgers and started eating. Watching them, Lynn retreated to her bedroom, closing the door behind her. She sat down in the chair beside her bed, buried her face in her hands, and cried.